anyone listening who's like, oh, these guys are feminist simps. First of all, I don't care that you call me that. But second of all, I'm going to kind of provide a critique of some aspects of modern feminism toward the end. And this weighs heavily on one of those critiques, which is the way risk aversion and female social dynamics can cause problems when they are in leadership roles within specific kinds of institutions. So just preview of coming attractions. We'll get to that.
The reading philosophers is the way to go. If you want to have serious opinions about philosophical issues, you need to seriously study. You can't just watch Ben Shapiro dunks on feminist compilation number 5. Like I understand why people watch stuff like that, but if you want to have a serious intellectual view, you need to be a serious intellectual.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Learn Arena podcast. I am your host, Trey Goff, co-founder and CEO of Learn Arena. With me here is our head of educational content and in-house philosopher, Gabriel Mitchell. Today, we will be continuing our controversial topics series, where we take a deep, nuanced dive to help you better think about and understand some of the most hot-button issues of today. To reiterate, as we've done for the last few episodes, the entire point of this series is to help you learn to think critically and think in a very nuanced and objective and rational way about some topics that are normally deeply emotion-laden and topics that often end up splitting groups into kind of tribal and ideological camps and lead to complete impasses in discourse, things that we seemingly aren't allowed to talk about or aren't allowed to question, or it is very controversial to do so. So we want to leave you not with a particular opinion about the specific controversial topic. We're not going to tell you what to believe or what you should believe or what's the most rational to believe. We're just going to share with you both sides of whatever the controversy at hand may be. We'll dive into both our personal opinions as well as steel manning the oppositional view of what we think. And hopefully you come away with it with a deeper, more nuanced understanding of the world, and more importantly, the ability to think more critically about really thorny topics. So with that, today we will be discussing feminism. The favorite topic of many a conservative commentator, as well as many progressive thinkers as well. This topic comes up often, and it's actually funny. So the way we typically structure these before we come to you guys with these is we think through from a philosophical first principles perspective, like what is the topic we're discussing? And with feminism in particular, this was really hard, actually, because the kind of typical conception of feminism, most people agree with, and they don't mean feminism when they say feminism. Yeah. It's a very confusing topic. So Gabriel, can you help kind of enlighten us a little bit? What do we even mean by, what is the definition of the word feminism? What are we even talking about?
Yeah. It's really hard to pinpoint a proper definition. And I think part of what's going on is we're dealing with both a set of ideas and a historical movement. And so when you're dealing with historical movements evolve, which means the definition of the ideas end up evolving, where ideas themselves tend to be more static, movements evolve. And so you kind of have this tension where you're dealing with, like, how do we properly define these terms? If we give it like the most basic dictionary definition, it's something like the advocacy of women's rights on the basis of the equality of the sexes. This is directly from the Oxford Dictionary. But there's an economist and philosopher, Brian Kaplan, who we're both very familiar with, and he recently published a book that was under the title of Don't Be a Feminist. It was a book that he was writing for his daughter as a collection of essays, and the essays weren't just about gender, but the most controversial essay in that collection of books was his Don't Be a Feminist essay. And he makes the note that these really simplistic definitions that are dealing with just like advocating for equal rights or something don't really illuminate what's going on with the feminist movements or with the proper definitions. Because as you mentioned, like if you just look at the polling data, the vast majority of men and women believe in equality of the sexes, if you give it a very broad sort of context, right? It is quite rare, certainly in our contemporary times, to find anyone who's against women voting. And if they are against it, it's usually not from this perspective of like, oh, women don't deserve rights. It's usually this kind of consequentialist view of like trying to achieve their desired political outcomes or something like that. And so virtually everyone, at least in the United States, in this kind of Western liberalized country, tend to believe in some conception of at least political equality among men and women. And so he kind of makes the claim that defining it as something as simple as the men the view that men and women should be treated equally is not really a good, strong definition. And even I've noticed from feminist thinkers themselves, like Bell Hooks, who is probably the most concrete example of someone who might refer to as like an intersectional feminist. Even she has some interesting quotes where she says stuff like, "The central problem with feminist discourse has been our inability to either arrive at a consensus of opinion about what feminism is, or accept definitions that can serve as points of unification." So you'll notice even critics of feminism and people internally in feminism have really struggled to try and find a good definition. Brian Kaplan suggests that perhaps a better definition for feminism is something along the lines of believing that men and women are unequal in contemporary society, and that this is a problem, perhaps caused by what we might refer to as a patriarchy, which is another word we'll even define. And so he sort of takes this kind of feminism is this perspective of a critique of society and this assertion that there are various inequalities. So it's not just the desire to abolish inequalities, but it's the assertion that there are these unfairness and inequalities. On the other hand, Bell Hooks, who, as I mentioned, ends up kind of really laying the foundation for what we currently call intersectional feminism. She kind of framed it as perhaps feminism needs to be expanded to be almost like a type of class analysis. That the goal is, and I'll just quote her directly, actually. She says, feminism, like a good definition of feminism, should be something like the movement to end sexism, exploitation, and oppression. Which, of course, would have to mean that you acknowledge that these sort of things exist in society. And I'm not here to resolve the conflict of the definition, but simply to note that there are a lot of competing definitions. Part of the strength, I think, of Brian Kaplan's approach and why he doesn't consider himself a feminist is that if you dive into his writings, he kind of asks, like, okay, well, if feminism is the belief that there are inequalities of the sexes, then he explores kind of the data and asks, okay, well, are these inequalities legitimate and worth critiquing and worth caring about? No one really cares that there are no women in like sewage work, right? Like that is an inequality and perhaps an unfairness, but it's not a legitimate concern from like a political philosophical perspective, at least as far as I'm concerned. And so when he kind of looks at that and dives into some of the data, and I really encourage anyone to take a look at the article or the full book. Again, it's called "Don't Be a Feminist." He the strength of his approach is that he critiques sort of the assertions of examples that a feminist might offer for examples of inequalities and issues. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't issues, especially on like a personal, individual level. I think sometimes as human beings, we have a tendency to take things that are personal social issues. Oh, my dad was a sexist, or my boyfriend was mean to me. And we have a tendency to take those sort of personal issues and project them into political, societal issues. My dad was a sexist, my boyfriend was mean, therefore there is a patriarchy that is trying to oppress women or something. And certainly if we look at the historical data, and we'll get at exploring kind of the history of feminism and the various different waves that we talk about, there have been concrete examples of men conspiring to keep women from voting or keep women from being in the workplace and things. But if we're talking about contemporary modern America, while there are still issues, and we'll get into some of the issues and some of the reasons why feminism still has value, a lot of the popular ideas that feminists focus on have empirical issues with showing to be real. And so again, hard to pinpoint an exact definition, but there's kind of a range that deals primarily with an acknowledgement of certain social problems and a desire to fix them, focusing around sex and inequality and unfairness.
Absolutely. And I'm going to take a bit of a different perspective here just to, again, help our listeners kind of get a new perspective on these things, perhaps a new lens from which to view this. And this is a lens that is helpful for examining a number of social and political issues. One of the most impactful books I have ever read was by an economist philosopher named Robin Hanson, and the book was called The Elephant in the Brain. And the basic thesis of the book, if I were to sum it up in a sentence, would rather a bit tongue-in-cheek be social status signaling rules everything around me. And if you view the feminist movement, especially modern feminism, but even the very early days, uh, through this lens of social signaling. So effectively, Robin Hanson's argument is most human activity is actually driven by social signaling and social status signaling. For the evolutionary purpose, the reason we evolved to be this way was so that we could reproduce, because higher status people, both male and female, net end up reproducing with higher quality and higher value mates. So we end up as a species highly prioritizing social status and social signaling and ways to signal our social status in a credible and costly way. And the costliness lends to the credibility. So I highly encourage all of you to read this book if you have not. But I'm sharing the brief kind of Cliff Notes version of it right now, because I think it's a really instructive lens through which to view the feminist movement, actually. To take but one small example, Gabriel mentioned earlier, the most deadly professions in the world, from offshore oil field workers to Arctic lumber mills to infrastructure work, construction, all of the professions that have the highest fatality rates and the highest workplace injury rates are 95 to 99% male. And that's not an exaggeration. The data, the American Enterprise Institute has a great chart on this that we can throw on screen here. And the reason feminists don't really care about that, and the reason that you see the feminist movement, even in its early days, focused initially on getting women into the workplace to be things like lawyers and doctors and politicians and executives in companies, is because all of those aforementioned professions are high status. They're high social status, right? There is a high degree of kind of social worth that goes along with those professions, and a bit of social and political power as a result of that social status that comes with those professions. So women and men both in the feminist movement have focused pretty narrowly, if you view it through this lens, on rectifying the gender imbalances that were initially quite intentional and direct and purposeful, as Gabriel mentioned earlier, in higher status fields and in higher status activities. Okay. And a lot of kind of critics of feminism like to point this out and say, oh, you're being hypocritical. You don't all want to be plumbers, which I think misses the point entirely. Because if you put yourself in the feminist shoes for a second, like, yeah, there's nothing stopping them from going to be a plumber. The entire point of the feminist movement writ large, among many other things, is that, hey, there are these high social status things that we quite literally are not allowed to do. Like culturally, people won't hire us for. Socially, people will not even consider us for. And we would like to also be considered for the high social status things, not just the low social status things. Like, yeah, sure, I could go be a plumber and nobody's going to stop me from doing that. And there's not a social norm around me not being a lumberjack. I could go do it if I want to, but I can't go do, for example, in the 1950s, go be a CEO. You literally couldn't do it. So this is often, this lens, I think, is quite helpful to actually think about some of the things that we see feminists actively advocating for and actively doing. It can help paint a picture of, well, why is it that they only care about like this narrow set of professions, or they only care about representation in this specific way? I think this social signaling and social status lens can also be a helpful way to view the history of the feminist movement.
Yeah, I really love that. And it kind of bleeds very naturally into an important term we need to define here, which is patriarchy. So, of course, most feminists view the societies that they're in as a type of patriarchy. Patriarchy, of course, very literally means rule of the father. You can imagine on a small scale, like if you have a family structure and the dad has full total control over everything, that's what we consider like a patriarchy, or at least has the dominant control. The assertion is that society on the large scale is dominated by men and controlled by men, and so therefore we exist in kind of a patriarchy. And I can empathize with this because I know like every woman I've known in my life has at least some story about moments in their career development or in university or something where they felt like men were kind of the barrier to their entry. Maybe they wanted to be a physics PhD and they were fighting hard to work towards it, but they always felt like the men never invited them to the after class kind of meet-togethers and study sessions and stuff. Something even small like that, where it's not necessarily a rights violation, but there is kind of this social harm that's happened, and it's likely not even the case that the men involved are consciously conspiring to say, oh, we don't want this girl at our thing, but just kind of men naturally are attracted to each other, and men are more naturally kind of eager to spend time together because we just kind of know each other better. This actually pulls back to some conversations we had about gender dynamics in the previous podcasts. Men and women are different, and just naturally people tend to gravitate towards people who are similar to them. And so while historical feminists have acknowledged definitive like legal barriers that we would from our perspective view as rights violations, there's also kind of this sort of social issue going on that's much more abstract and harder to understand and define, and sometimes just has a lot to do with anecdotal experience. And so patriarchy we could define as the general control of men over society. Now, as I'm sure you have some views on, that doesn't necessarily mean that, like, even if you believe we live in a patriarchy, that doesn't necessarily mean men have total control over every single factor of society, whether that's academia or CEOs or whatever. And something I find kind of curious in exploring the patriarchy is that we probably have good reason to believe that most historical societies, if not basically all, have had some sort of male leadership roles as their primary sort of function. And so we might describe, say, early tribal societies, and then, of course, kingdoms, and kind of the evolution, that most of human history has been patriarchal. And it's worth asking the question, like, one, is it natural? Two, is it so natural that it's inescapable? And three, does it actually have benefits? And of course, it has costs. It's very obvious that there has been negatives to patriarchy, but what sort of benefits might we find? And so I've kind of just been doing a lot of reading on this. I've literally spent the past day or so just kind of digging around. And so the first question, as I mentioned, is patriarchy natural? And I think there's good evidence for that. There's some evidence that early tribal societies, like really early on, may have had more egalitarian social structures, though our level of being able to totally study that is kind of up in the air because we're just looking at essentially human fossils and trying to extrapolate what their social structures were like. But at least by the time, at least a little bit before agriculture is developed, we have good reason to believe that men kind of dominate society. There's an anthropologist.
To add,
yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, Gabriel. Go ahead.
Dude, I have so much to say. Why don't you just step in real quick, and I'll keep going.
No, you're good. So yeah, as you go through stuff, I'll just pepper little anecdote or little fun factoids that reinforce this. So I was doing some reading about this as well, coming prior to this, and another kind of piece of evidence to suggest that, or two pieces of evidence to suggest that patriarchy is natural in the sense that like human evolutionary biology and psychology kind of points in that direction, is when we look at the history of uncontacted tribes upon first contact with more developed nations, and especially anthropologists who specialize in finding uncontacted tribes and examining their social structures, it is extremely rare to find matriarchies. And when we look at history, we find the same thing. By and large, the overwhelming majority, and I mean over 80% of distinct societies that we find that developed over time, develop into patriarchies. And there's reason to believe from an evolutionary biology perspective, that's not that surprising, for the simple reason that, two simple reasons. One, women are far higher in agreeableness than men, which means the kind of inverse implication of that is that men are more likely to directly engage in conflict over resources and power and control, right? So they're literally just more likely to try to unilaterally assert control effectively. And then two, males form alliances much more naturally and in hierarchical formations, much more naturally and rapidly than women. Whereas women often will not do so and are reticent to form same-sex alliances and hierarchies for a bunch of complex evolutionary biology reasons that effectively boil down to not wanting competition over resources for resource-providing men, effectively. And we even see evidence of this literally today. There was a recent study that I linked to in the Learn Arena Codex that had a fascinating finding. So these researchers took a bunch of teams within corporations, okay, and randomly assigned some to have female leaders or some to have male leaders. And these were like real tasks within the company. These employees in the company didn't know they were part of a study other than just consenting to be part of research in a general abstract way. The researchers had these teams do a similar project, okay, that had a cash prize associated with it. And the researchers gave the team leader the cash prize and said, hey, you distribute this amongst your team members however you want. The researchers also randomized the team compositions such that you end up with male-male teams, you end up with male-female teams, you end up with male mixed gender teams, and vice versa. You end up with female-female teams, female-male, etc. And what they found was overwhelmingly the men were much more likely to spread the cash prize from the completion of the project with their male kind of underlings who they're helping to nurture and help grow within the corporation. And female leaders were far less likely to share the resources and the cash prize from the project with their female underlings because of this intersex kind of competition dynamic. So there's reasons, even from recent psychological research, to show that patriarchy is in a sense natural, insofar as for whatever reason, it is where our evolutionary biology pushed our psychology.
Yeah, I definitely, even anecdotally, I've noticed, like, I talk to the women in my life and they talk about some of the struggles they have in the workforce. While there are cases of, men who are being rude to them or being creepy or something, almost always there's also a bunch of stories about the women being kind of catty and having the little gossip groups, and there's like a big sort of psychological cost to not being part of the in group if you're women in an office place. And where men don't seem to experience that as much, we have other issues. We're more likely to fist fight each other or something, but men work together in ways that women don't. And as mentioned again and again and again, men and women are just different. And women certainly have their strengths. There are a reason why women tend to make very good, daycare center employees or teachers of preschool students and stuff like that. There are certain biological or social whatever factors that have led to these strengths. But unfortunately, sometimes these things also come with costs that can have negative outcomes in particular environments.
That's exactly right. And I'll just note that I'll add more on this toward the end of the conversation. So as a preview of coming attractions for anyone listening who's like, oh, these guys are feminist simps. First of all, I don't care that you call me that. But second of all, I'm going to kind of provide a critique of some aspects of modern feminism toward the end. And this weighs heavily on one of those critiques, which is the way risk aversion and female social dynamics can cause problems when they are in leadership roles within specific kinds of institutions. So just preview of coming attractions. We'll get to that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because our goal here first is let's just make sure we have the definitions clear, right? We've kind of talked about how hard it is to define feminism, acknowledging that, say, Brian Kaplan's feminism is definition of feminism is something like the view that society generally treats men more fairly than women. That's exactly quote for him. Where for someone like Bell Hooks, who's the intersectional feminist type, feminism is the movement to end sexism, in sexist exploitation and oppression. So these are the two kind of competing definitions we're working with. Both of these have built into it the assumption that there is some sort of male dominance in society, or at least the belief there is male dominance in society, which we're referring to as patriarchy. We've established that patriarchy probably has natural sort of origins, but you and I can agree that just because something natural doesn't necessarily mean it's good.
That's called the naturalistic fallacy.
Yes, or the appeal to nature, maybe another way to put it. So when I think about patriarchy in society, I think even a feminist would acknowledge that there are contexts where they're fine with male control, even if it's a consensual kink kind of encounter, right? And I'm using this as a very specific example because it illustrates that the problem with patriarchy probably isn't necessarily men control. The problem is it being forced on people and it not benefiting everyone. So if we're going to have a patriarchy, which based off of what you and I have researched and we understand, we're probably going to have a patriarchy anyway. The question isn't how do we smash the patriarchy? How do we get rid of it? The question is how do we make sure the patriarchy is something that everyone actually benefits from? How do we promote, healthy masculinity and things like this, which of course ties into other podcasts we've had, and I really encourage people to check out those sorts of questions. And so, at the moment, as far as I can tell, patriarchy is probably natural. It's probably inescapable. So we got to ask these questions of kind of just how to have healthy versions of it. And I think to build on sort of continuing our understanding of feminism, maybe we should talk a little bit about what's sometimes called the waves of feminism, because this will highlight that there have been many different types of feminism throughout history, and there has been particular evolutions of the philosophy, and these evolutions can give us kind of a key into what do feminists actually want and what do women actually benefit from in society versus what do they find to be harmful, and how have these kind of things evolved with the movement and thinkers and things like that.
Absolutely. I think the classical kind of conception you have probably heard of when discussing feminism are the kind of waves of feminism, right? You have first wave, second wave, third wave, and now I believe we're on fourth wave. Although
Yeah.
the kind of dividing line between third and fourth is extremely ambiguous because
Hmm.
they often end up kind of focusing on the same intersectional themes. But Gabriel, why don't you walk us through kind of the waves of feminism, and then I will briefly walk us through some of the philosophies of kind of the key and the most influential
Yeah.
feminist thinkers of the 20th century or so. Some of the philosophers, the female philosophers that really focused on this issue.
Yes. So speaking of philosophers, probably the person who we would argue is like the start of what we call first wave feminism was probably Mary Wollstonecraft. I encourage you to maybe give her a quick Google right now, just so in case there's anything that kind of stands out that we're talking about it. But she wrote some various books about like feminism and political equality. And so first wave feminism, which we tend to understand as having started kind of early 20th century. Certainly, there have been historical movements that have advocated for certain progress in women's rights throughout history, but the proper sort of first wave that we see in Western societies, primarily the United States and Europe, um, starts somewhere around the early 20th century, and it's associated with what we refer to as classical liberalism, which is the historical political movement that advocated for individual rights, advocated for free markets, advocated for free speech, advocated for viewing the state not as the ultimate power that dominates everything, but the state as a useful tool that we're all kind of working together to build to protect our rights and promote our well-being. So classical liberalism is that tradition. First wave feminism sort of grew out of that, an acknowledgement that, hey, we care about all these individual rights. We care about, political freedom and freedom of speech and economic freedom. Well, why aren't we extending that to women? That's the basic core question of first wave feminism, which is why first wave feminists were the ones who advocated for women voting. There was the suffragettes and the suffragettes, or whatever they're called. And they were probably the core policy goal was women voting, but there was also policy goals of just eliminating those legal barriers, not just the social barriers, but the legal barriers that kept women from entering various industries, or kept women from getting educations, or kept women from having representation in political power. This is, I think, probably the least controversial feminist wave, though a lot of contemporary feminists have some critiques emphasizing that these are very kind of Western sort of goals. Very, there's this term that the intersectional feminists float around where they call it white feminism, that it was just a bunch of white women who are primarily concerned about their white freedom and not necessarily the freedom of, say, black women or something like that. And there's perhaps some legitimacy to that critique, but we can kind of get into that later. So then somewhere in the 60s, we have the development of second wave feminism, which is sometimes just called the women's liberation movement. This is where things shifted from that kind of core fundamental political rights of like just being allowed to exist freely to slightly more abstract kind of things, and often starting to critique the social conditions of womanhood. This is where we start getting into questions about reproductive rights, start getting questions about domestic violence, start exploring questions about equal pay and things like that. But there's also second wave feminism is starting to expand outside of that kind of primarily white Western woman sort of control over the feminist movement, and to start asking questions about race and how it relates to gender, and start looking at other political philosophies and how they might relate to feminism, particularly exploring maybe like anti-colonial ideas, or exploring like Marxism and its connection to these sorts of things. This is where Bell Hooks, who I was mentioning earlier, this is where she did kind of a lot of her writings, 60s, 70s, 80s. And then this laid the foundation for what we now call third wave feminism, which is probably the most fundamental definition is intersectional feminism. Though, as mentioned, there is kind of a fourth wave feminism, and how it kind of relates is hard to talk about. And I'd say the primary kind of goal of this kind of third wave feminism is to explore these questions of gender equality and reproductive rights, but from a philosophical perspective that combines it with class analysis, combines it with anti-racism, combines with all these sorts of things, and creates a less specific, but perhaps a broader sort of perspective. There's also you can find some writings that argue that third wave feminism is also more individualistic, not in the philosophical sense of promoting individual rights and caring about individualism, but in the individualistic sense of feminism now becomes like a thing that everyone can have. You know, regardless of what color your skin is, regardless of whether you're a man or a woman, like feminism matters to you now. It's kind of intersectional, as in everyone's struggle is interconnected. And then fourth wave feminism is kind of ambiguous and hard to find. It's very, very much a new thing, something that probably didn't start until like 2005 or 2010 or so. And it's defined probably more by the technological spread of feminism and the use of like social media and stuff. But it also kind of acknowledges the feminist struggles within non-Western societies, say in the Middle East and stuff like that. And so it's as mentioned, kind of hard to get like a really clear definition of fourth wave feminism, but those are some of the core tenets. And so that's first wave feminism, individualistic classical liberalism, primarily focused on fundamental political rights. Second wave feminism, expanding into the social and focusing on slightly more abstract rights like reproductive rights. Third wave feminism, the introduction of intersectionality, race theory, class theory, these sorts of things. And then fourth wave feminism is onlineness, but also globalness.
Absolutely. Thanks for that summary, Gabriel. And to kind of reiterate for everybody who may be thinking, like, why does this history matter? It matters an enormous amount, in no small part because a lot of modern feminists and people arguing against modern feminism do not have this historical context. So they literally don't know where the ideas they're arguing from even come from. So understanding this kind of intellectual lineage in this historical context of feminism is crucially important to understand why people make the arguments that they do today. Because, for example, right, a lot of feminists still make these vague kind of arguments about patriarchy, even though a lot of those accusations and those arguments now cause people to roll their eyes and are like, why are we talking about this? Because it's a kind of an outdated critique now, given that women reside in positions of power the world over, like heads of state, presidents, and prime ministers are women all over the world. Women are CEOs now. Women are the leaders in a bunch of research fields. A woman won the economics Nobel Prize just like a couple of weeks ago. So it kind of begs the question, when you hear modern feminists talking about the patriarchy, you rightly so maybe asking yourself, what patriarchy? Well, it's because that was the historical kind of bedrock of feminism as in opposition to a patriarchy. So understanding these historical arguments can help you understand what in the world's going on today. I'll make another few points about the waves of feminism. So one thing I've learned actually only over the last year or so that was really fascinating to me is that even during first wave feminism, which again, as Gabriel said, was a lot about political rights. And if we boil it down to its essence, it was about the right to vote. Women were legally not allowed the right to vote until the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. There were a large group of women called the anti-suffragettes who ardently argued against suffrage. And in fact, we can put on screen here some of their pamphlets that they were passing out at the time to campaign against the passage of the 19th Amendment. And what's interesting is a lot of their arguments against women's suffrage, we now, with the benefit of the passage of time, can kind of evaluate on the merits to see if the predictions they made were true. And some of the things they said were, first, like, because 90% of women do not want or care about the vote, you should vote no on women's suffrage. You should vote no on women's suffrage because it means competition of women with men instead of cooperation. There's also some interesting notes about because it can be of no benefit commensurate with the additional expense involved, because it moves women kind of into the public sphere and out of the private sphere, which is also comes from the thought of a feminist thinker and philosopher, Hannah Arendt, which I'll go over in a second. So I just thought it was very interesting that there were a strong group of women who were very much against this. And they were against it for reasons that I think we will find, looking back at the historical record, weren't entirely inaccurate. For example, what she's referring to, what the anti-suffragettes are referring to here with women being in competition with men instead of cooperation, is just manifestly true, right? So women and men are competing for the same jobs now. And the men and women are competing for the same positions and the same, especially high social status positions. And it has led to a degradation in the kind of dynamics between the sexes. There is manifestly a lot of especially economic competition between the sexes now, not to mention social. It also, she's entirely correct that it now puts a new burden on women, right? So this is a bit of an antiquated notion that I think was really important and why democracy worked previously and doesn't work as well now. That they're referring to here, which is that like the right to vote comes with a responsibility to vote responsibly and vote in an informed manner, right? So the argument here is like, well, women now have to learn a whole bunch of stuff about politics and philosophy and economics to be able to vote properly, when many women don't even want to do that. They kind of have a duty to do this now if they're going to exercise this right responsibly. So I just thought it was an interesting note that there were a lot of women that were strongly against this, and some of their, at least some of their arguments, still bear weight today. Now, some of them obviously do not, and were really funny. So, like another one of their main arguments was that most women are married, and therefore women's votes are only going to double their husband's vote or annul their husband's vote. And either way, that's bad. We should just leave it to the men, basically. Some kind of funny stuff like that. So that was the first note I wanted to make, was that there were a strong group of women, not just men, who were against giving women the right to vote back in the early 20th century. And then another kind of note on this is that I think if we look at it through the lens of some of the most influential philosophers and thinkers in the feminist movement, we can kind of understand the bedrock of intellectual ideas that were driving this movement. So as Gabriel mentioned, one key figure was Mary Wollstonecraft. She was a kind of a foundational figure, and she really started the kind of academic, rigorous study of feminist philosophy as a whole. And her primary focus was that women are not naturally inferior to men. So this sounds alien to our ears now because we often hear quite public arguments that that women are superior to men. But there used to be a kind of cultural milieu that argued like, no, women are dumb and emotional and stupid and silly, and obviously they can't vote. So it was a kind of revolutionary in her time to say like, actually, no, we are just as capable as men, and we're no kind of worse, or we're not inferior in some kind of moral or ethical worth sense to men. And she argued that women might only appear to be dumber, air quotes, than men because they weren't allowed to get fully educated, which was true. A lot of universities either didn't allow women or had very strict policies around not letting many women in. So they quite literally could not get the equal education to men. So she focused a lot on education. She also focused on something that you'll see immediately once I say it, is a through line that has run straight through to modern feminism as well, which is a critique of the norms around marriage and motherhood. She made ardent arguments against both kind of the way marriage is kind of carried out, that men ask the woman's father for permission to ask her to marry, that women are expected to be, at the time, women were obviously expected to be stay-at-home moms. It was an extreme aberration to have a two-income household at the time, which again sounds preposterous to us now. And she was arguing against those cultural norms at the time, that like, no, all of this is bad and we should be much more equal in our social and cultural norms, not just in education. So you can see these through lines still run through straight to today. And some of these are, again, quite antiquated because, for instance, right now, for every one man enrolling in a bachelor's degree program at a four-year university, there's 3 women. So women are actually drastically overeducated relative to men, or getting educated at far higher rates than men, to put a different frame on it. But you still see this today. Like the UN funds a bunch of educational movements to try to get women access to more education in developing and especially Muslim countries. So this is still a fight going on today that Mary Wollstonecraft started 60, 70 years ago. Now, the other 2 philosophers I want to mention here are Hannah Arendt and Simone de Beauvoir. Now, Hannah Arendt, although she wasn't like technically just a feminist per se, she was a philosopher writ large who happened to also focus on feminism and women's issues. Her core idea was that women had been historically and culturally relegated to effectively the private sphere. And what she meant by that was that there was a cultural norm at the time that like, oh, women are responsible for house and home and men are responsible for everything else, literally. That women rule the household, women take care of the kids, women cook dinner, women make sure the house is clean and kept up, and men do everything else, right? So she critiqued this kind of sharp delineation at the time between the public and the private sphere. And she argued that women had the right to be much more engaged in the public sphere and should not just be relegated to the private sphere. Simone de Beauvoir, who is the third feminist philosopher I want to mention here, and these are all 3 kind of the main figures you'll encounter if you want to go start reading feminist philosophy, is also a foundational, purely feminist thinker. And her work really centered around a book called The Second Sex, which I remember reading in college. And actually found her arguments quite interesting and accurate in many respects. So her core argument, if I had to boil it down to a sentence, is that women are conceived of as the other. What she means by that is any discussion of women at the time, and again, she was writing in the 1960s and 70s. Discussions of women historically and up to that time, socially and culturally, were done in contrast to and with reference to men, right? One of the easiest examples of this is like the Adam and Eve story, right? Like that woman was created from Adam's rib, that the woman was literally created to help Adam, basically, and was not her own kind of independent being without reference to Adam, without the donation of that rib, so to speak. And this norm kind of continued across social and cultural norms for centuries, literally, all the way up until some of her ideas in the 1960s and 70s, where she pointed out every conversation we have about women is only in reference to men. There's never a conversation about women qua women, basically. Women are always the other, was the way she put it. That man is the default and the female is the other, right? So these were the kind of three core feminist thinkers. And to wrap up de Beauvoir's arguments a little bit more, she argued that actually we should just consider women as women, and that women should have, as a result, a lot higher degree of autonomy and liberation. Now, a lot of her ideas were tied in with her lover, Sartre, who was an existentialist philosopher. So I'm going to kind of just bracket that for now. That's a very deep rabbit hole of the interplay between those two philosophies and their actual real life individual relationship, which was an absolute tornado. If you want some entertaining drama, you should go read about the relationship between de Beauvoir and Sartre, because it's quite entertaining. But these were the kind of the core feminist philosophical thinkers that you can see as I'm describing the ideas all have through lines kind of directly to modern feminism. So if you really want to deeply understand what is going on, both with historical modern feminist movements and both historical feminist movements and modern feminist movements, this is another one of those areas. Gabriel and I stress this often. Like, philosophy is more important than almost anything else. These ideas all come straight from the works of these philosophers. And if you actually want to understand the arguments at their core foundational level, you need to go read the source material, not just listen to random public commentators on gender and feminism kind of spout off, because you'll often hear, oh, that argument's half baked, or that doesn't make a lot of sense. But it's because they're half parroting 20% of a piece of a Simone de Beauvoir philosophical argument that someone they learned from heard 20 years ago, right? So if you want to get the real meat of the matter, you need to go to the source. So Gabriel, I'd love your thoughts and any additions you have on the kind of feminist philosophers.
Yes, I really want to echo that reading philosophers is the way to go. If you want to have serious opinions about philosophical issues, you need to seriously study. You can't just watch Ben Shapiro dunks on feminist compilation number 5. Like I understand why people watch stuff like that, but if you want to have a serious intellectual view, you need to be a serious intellectual. That's why we're building Learn Arena, is to give you resources. That's why we have the community of the Discord, so people can recommend books to each other and talk about these things. You really need to dive into it. I just want to mention 2 figures that I think are really important for understanding contemporary feminism, what we might refer to as like intersectional feminism, which I think we'll take some time to get into about the pros and cons of. But first is Kimberly Crenshaw. She's the one who actually coined the term intersectional feminism. And she also was a key figure in what we now call critical race theory. And her basic intent, as is the basic intent of intersectional ideas, is just to acknowledge that struggles are interconnected, and race particularly is connected to gender and connected to class and all these sorts of things. But I also want to mention Judith Butler. The reason I want to mention Judith Butler is that it's undeniable that questions about gender, questions about feminism have to do with gender, and questions about gender right now culturally are very complicated. And part of why that's complicated is because philosophers like Judith Butler have been exploring questions about what even is gender in the first place. What does it even mean to be a woman? And so for Judith Butler, gender is this kind of socially constructed, what she specifically calls a performance, though just calling it that really oversimplifies her work. It's I really encourage people to actually dive into and explore it. But for her, gender isn't just this kind of biological sex, but has this sort of socially constructed components, which helps us better understand why modern feminism puts a heavy emphasis on like embracing, say, trans women and stuff. And in the future, we can have a deeper conversation about transness and biology versus social and stuff like that. But I just want to emphasize that these are two kind of key modern figures, in addition to Bell Hooks, who I mentioned at the very beginning of the podcast, for understanding why contemporary feminism is the way it is, why it's intersectional, why it's pro-trans, and all these sorts of things. And speaking of which, I think a really great spot for us to kind of focus on here is just what do you think are some of the pros and cons of contemporary feminist thought, particularly that sort of intersectionality, and if we can do our best to kind of steelman it and think about the strengths of it.
So I think that's a great question, Gabriel. And I want to pause for the audience as well. I'm trying to make a habit of doing this more while we go through these shows, which is to highlight for you kind of the direct practical relevance to your life of a lot of the stuff we're talking about here and how it can improve your understanding of the world and therefore your ability to navigate the world. And let's imagine for a second, before I dive into this, that you are already deeply opposed to feminist ideology and to intersectional ideology, to critical race theory, et cetera. You cannot possibly, even if that is your pre-existing stance that you can't be shaken from, you cannot possibly have good arguments against those positions and understand why the people that believe those things believe them if you do not try to take the time to fully think through their arguments, to fully understand where they're coming from, so that you can actually meaningfully and efficaciously communicate with them and even strengthen your own arguments. If for no other reason than you want to strengthen your own arguments, you should spend some considerable time doing something that a rationalist actually coined this term, and I love it, called steel manning. So this refers to the straw man fallacy, right? Where like me and Gabriel are arguing, and Gabriel says something like, "Oh, well, I think the minimum wage should be reduced," and then I would say, "Oh, so you hate poor people, right?" That's a straw man. Obviously, he didn't argue that he hates poor people. The opposite of that would be a steel man, which is trying as hard as you can to deeply understand and defend your opponent's argument so that you can demonstrate deep understanding of it and strengthen your own arguments, or perhaps come to realize that your own opinions and arguments about the thing might be inaccurate, and therefore you need to change the way you view the world. Because remember, the objective here is to learn as much ground truth about reality as we can so that we can leave our impact on this world, right? So the ability to steelman well is something that everyone should develop, because even if you're making a business decision, right, and you're at loggerheads with your co-founder, or you and your boss are arguing about a thing to do, well, if you can steelman that person's position, then you can understand it much better. You can communicate your ideas to them much more clearly in a way that will matter to them. Or you can understand why actually, oh, maybe I was wrong, and the better thing to do is in fact what they're suggesting. So just wanted to plant that flag that like steel manning is a very important skill set that you can apply immediately, like as soon as this podcast ends. And you will, I think, immediately find that you're able to both communicate and debate better, but also make better critical decisions as you move through life, especially when you're in disagreements with people about decisions to make. So to steelman for a moment, intersectional feminism, the argument effectively goes something like as follows. Let's imagine this was especially even more true, say, 10 to 20 years ago than it is right now, but it's still somewhat true today, right? So, but I'm going to take like, say, 20 years ago, let's say or 30 years ago, say the 1980s. There was still a pretty good deal of cultural discrimination, of people having low opinions of certain specific minorities, whether that be African Americans, whether that be Native Americans, whatever. And the intersectional feminist argument, which I think is pretty accurate, it was at the time, probably much less so now because of a diversity, equity, and inclusion movement, which we'll get into. But especially when these ideas were first promulgated, it was just objectively true that you could have a white woman applying for a job, an African American woman, and a Native American woman, and assuming similar qualifications, 9.9 times out of 10, the white woman was going to get the job. So the argument here from an intersectional feminist perspective is that actually feminism up to this point has been about the freedom of white women, and that it has not and cannot fully address and compensate for and ameliorate the injustices of discrimination and oppression against women of color, what are now referred to as BIPOC women, although I hate that term, but I'll use it here to steelman. And that women that are not white women, right, that are not Caucasian, face an entirely different type of and level of discrimination from white women. And this exact same analysis goes for class as well. So to kind of the term intersectional never made sense to me until I literally pictured it, right? So the argument is basically like you have a line. Imagine a line, and that line represents kind of discrimination against women, right? Just women broadly. The point of intersectional feminism is that actually there's not just one line. There's another line that intersects with that line that refers to discrimination against Black people specifically. So you have a combination of, right, female discrimination and anti-black discrimination, right? And then you layer on top of that a Marxist kind of class analysis, and you end up with a world where, and I think this was objectively true again up till the modern social movements. You end up in a world where a poor black woman, right, ends up in a worse position and unable to get the same jobs, even if she has the same qualifications, as a wealthy or upper middle class white woman because of the social connection she has and because of inherent kind of cultural and social discrimination. So the intersectional feminist movement is focused on pointing this out and saying, hey, we need to rectify this. That it's not fair that just because a woman is black, she's not treated as fairly as a white woman, or just because a woman is a Native American or in Indigenous American, I don't know what the current PC term is, so whatever, you know what I mean, does not have access to the same high social status, importantly, opportunities that, say, a white woman or a rich white woman especially might have. Would you kind of agree with that, Steelman, or want to add anything to it, Gabriel?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good strength. It does seem obvious to me that because white women had more power in society or more freedom, that their wants and needs in the feminist movement was kind of the initial focus. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they themselves are racist or something, but I can understand why that's a problem, and why, if we want to make progress for feminism and women in general, you kind of have to broaden the scope. I also want to suggest that one of the strengths of the intersectional feminism is the acknowledgement that the inequalities and unfairnesses that women are experiencing aren't exclusively about a specific law, but has to do with norms, ethics, and institutions. Now, unfortunately, from my perspective, it seems that most intersectional feminists are blaming capitalism, and it's not clear to me that capitalism is actually the villain here. But the idea that there are institutions that are the problem, and cultural norms that are a problem, and cultural ethics that are a problem is worth investigating. You and I are libertarians. One of the aspects that we believe in libertarianism is that consent is like a core philosophical principle for dealing with people. And a lot of feminists understand that on the personal level. They are very strong advocates for men learning to navigate consent better when it comes to, meeting women at the bar or something like that. But if you acknowledge that feminism isn't just about specific actions, but is also about institutions, then you can also pay attention to how consent relates to institutional power. You and I would probably believe that state power, at least most modern states, aren't exactly consensual, haven't exactly gotten their power from the consent of the governed. And I think there's a very strong kind of feminist intersectional perspective that overlaps with this. Like, if you acknowledge that the foundations of our political economy, foundations of our political power, is a violation of consent, then there's a very obvious kind of feminist perspective and overlap there. If consent is such a core aspect of both libertarianism and feminism, then it just seems to me that they're onto something there. I think they have misdiagnosed the villain. They tend to misdiagnose it as capitalism. I think more likely they should be diagnosing the villain as perhaps the state or something like that. But those are the big additions I want to add. And perhaps from there, now that we've established this kind of steel man, or what we believe to be sort of the best strengths of this kind of contemporary modern intersectional feminism, perhaps we can dive into some of the critiques. I did have one kind of soft critique I wanted to offer up. I know you have some more specific stuff, but something that came to my mind while I was thinking about this was like broadening the scope of feminism has a lot of strengths. It includes peoples whose voices have not been heard, but it also has a lot of weaknesses. Every time a social movement expands its scope of who it's trying to fight for, there's an attempt at inclusion, but inclusion comes with the trade-offs of focus. And ironically, often some people lose out when there's a broad inclusion. I think about there's this example of a year or two ago, there was this video floating around of an American socialist group was having some sort of conference. And the speakers were talking about the ideas, and every now and then someone raised their hand to bring up some niche sort of issue they were dealing with. One person raised their hand to say, hey, we really would appreciate if people don't clap. There are people in the room who have auditory issues, and maybe we should snap instead, or just wave our hands or something like that. And then someone said, hey, I don't like it when you refer to the public as you guys. That's not inclusive to like people with different gender identities. And someone else, said, hey, why are we focusing on this topic when we could be focusing on this topic, and so on and so forth, so forth. And at the very end of the video, someone raises their hand and says, can we please stop debating everything because the buses leave at a certain time and we're running out of time. And so this is a perfect concrete example about how every additional step that was taking to try to be inclusive to some people, even though the goal was a radical inclusion, a goal was a broad inclusion, ended up excluding some people. So I think the vision of total inclusion not only weakens the focus and thus weakens your progress, it also actually ends up excluding people. You just have to acknowledge that there are limited resources and you need to focus in and decide who you're going to focus on, because a broad approach doesn't actually exist. So that's the main kind of concern I have when I'm thinking about this. And I know you have some other concerns you'd like to get into.
Yeah, so I have many things I want to get into. First, I just want to respond to what you just said and add to it. If you want to see an example of this play out in real time and in one of the funniest ways possibly imaginable, go watch a laugh reel, a highlight reel of the Democratic Socialists of America convention last year. The convention was instantaneously derailed, effectively, precisely because of this broad inclusion problem, because they immediately started, before they could even get started, saying, hey, we should ban clapping because it is ableist and not inclusive of those of us who have auditory and sensory issues because of our autism or other sensory related issues that they've developed over their lifetime. And then another person came up and said that they were pissed that it didn't start with a land acknowledgement, and that they actually it's immoral and unethical that the effort didn't start with a land acknowledgement. And there's a highlight reel of these that, like, with no edits whatsoever, just watching the things they're saying for most normal people is genuinely hilarious, and I highly encourage you to go check it out to see in real time what Gabriel's talking about. When you build a social movement that includes everyone, you by definition are not going to satisfy everyone, and it just splinters almost immediately. We've seen this in more intense terms over the starting in the 70s and moving forward, with the kind of Angela Davis radical Black liberation feminism splitting from the more traditional feminist and social movements. So this happens a lot. It's effectively when you expand the team, you have to you by definition also limit what you're able to do, paradoxically enough, and limit your capabilities and resources. Now, I also want to address a few points that are kind of critical of feminism. The first, and kind of the easiest, this is an easy dunk, but something a lot of people don't even realize, I don't think. Feminism is often like inherently anti-capitalist, as Gabriel mentioned earlier. The two go hand in hand, and that often is just like directly counterproductive. And even if you take it at face value, is just contrary to the facts. So Gary Becker is this economist from the Chicago School that won a Nobel Prize in, I think, the 1970s or 80s for his seminal work modeling discrimination. And what he found, when you look at the empirical data and you construct proper economic models of discrimination, is that discriminatory firms get outcompeted. So let me think about this logically for a second, right? You have a pool of labor, you have a pool of talent and of human capital that you can hire for whatever it is that you're doing, right? Well, let's imagine you're considering 10,000 applicants, but then the guy up the street has the exact same business as you, doing the same thing, except he hates women. He just cut his applicant pool from 10,000 to 5,000. Mathematically, the probability that he is able to find the perfect fit, right, the person with the maximal human capital for whom the offer works for them for employment, the probability he finds that person is much lower if he cuts the supply of human capital, the supply of labor, the number of people he's considering, by 50%. So what Gary Becker found, and he found this both empirically, meaning like in the actual data, and from a model perspective, from just kind of a theory first principles perspective, is that discriminatory firms just simply get outcompeted. Now, he was focused mainly on race, but the same results hold for misogynistic discrimination. If you refuse to hire women, then you're not going to hire Claudia Golden, who just won the Nobel Prize in economics, right? An unbelievably talented thinker and researcher and academic. So I would just point out that, like, actually literally the incentives created by capitalism to purely maximize self-interested profit by itself ends up over time, so long as there is a free and open market, ameliorating discrimination. You might be thinking to yourself, but what about the 1960s when there was a bunch of discrimination against African Americans specifically? And what both Gary Becker found and this fantastic book that I highly recommend called The Color of Law, which details this long history of actually, for example, landowners would want to sell their house to a black family because the black family would pay more for it. But either the mortgage lender or the municipality or the state literally legally banned them from doing so. So often discrimination has to be enforced effectively at the point of a gun. Because an important lesson here, an important thing to remember when we're talking about discrimination and legal institutions, at the end of the day, every law is enforced at the point of a gun, right? So when we look at the historical record, again, you can go read this book to read just how shocking this was. Often municipalities and legal jurisdictions would adopt formal institutional rules against selling to African Americans, for example. And we find very similar things with women. They would often just outlaw, like it was not legal to hire women for certain professions, or there were certain regulatory and bureaucratic institutions that formally made it effectively impossible to hire women. So that's the first thing. The actual incentives capitalism creates to maximize profit means, by definition, discriminatory firms lose, and egalitarian firms that will hire anyone and not discriminate based on race or color or ethnicity or gender win in the marketplace. Now, to shift gears a little bit, let me go over a few of the high points of, I think, critiques of modern feminism that are most impactful and most important. The first, which is a bit counterintuitive, and I want to flesh it out, is that it's really bad for women. Often you'll hear arguments against feminism saying like, oh, men are getting screwed over in a number of ways now. We discussed that extensively on our gender dynamics episode, which you can go back and listen to if you want to brush up on those arguments. But that's actually not even the whole story. Modern feminism is really bad for women. So the first thing is, and this has been a very consistent trend going on for decades now as the feminist movement has gained steam, on basically any metric you care to look at, whether that be self-reported happiness, whether that be anxiety diagnoses, anxiety disorder diagnoses from psychiatrists, depression diagnoses from psychiatrists, suicidal ideation, suicide attempts. If you look at anything that relates to mental and psychological well-being, women have gotten progressively worse at this over time and are doing way, way worse than men. And this has steadily increased in conjunction with the continued victories of feminist movements and more egalitarian social and cultural movements. And if you think about it a little bit, like you can see why that's the case. So there's, and I actually don't even have to make this point. There have been a number of viral TikToks that have, in recent days, in recent weeks, made this same claim.
This is my first job, like my first 9-to-5 job after college, and I'm in person, and I'm commuting in the city, and it takes forever to get there. There's no way I'm going to be able to afford living in the city right now, so that's off the table. Like, duh! I get on the train at 7:30, and I don't get home till like 6:15 earliest, and then like I don't.
So there's been a bunch of viral posts from young women recently who say, effectively, they hate having to go work a 9-to-5. They hate the fact that they had to compete in the marketplace against men. Some of the women jokingly are like, oh, I'm not built for this. Like, I don't want to be doing this. I'm competing against men every day at work. I'm working 60 hours a week. Like, I don't constitutionally want to do this. And we also see this in survey data. When we look at the most egalitarian countries like Switzerland, Norway, Sweden, some of the Western European countries that are extremely gender egalitarian, those countries, in those countries and in America as well, which is very gender egalitarian, we see consistent survey results between the 60 and 80% mark, where 60 and 80% of women say if it were possible for them, if they could afford it, they would much rather be stay-at-home moms, which is a extremely counterintuitive finding when you actually listen to kind of feminist media and the girl boss cultural movement. Most women don't actually want that. Like, women's revealed preferences and women's stated preferences are that they would much rather not be doing that, but they're forced to by economic circumstance and by social and cultural pressure, which, remember, as we've mentioned multiple times now, women are far more agreeable, which means they go along with social and cultural pressure at a much higher rate than men. They're more willing to they're less willing rather to run contrary to whatever they see as the social and cultural norm for what they should be doing. So we see this in a variety of egalitarian countries. We also see in these more egalitarian countries, and including in the United States, where it is formally illegal to discriminate for any role on the basis of gender, that women still, to this day, select into what the acronym is the health professions. I can't remember the full acronym, but it's like healthcare, education, administration. I can't remember the other letters, but those are some of the core ones. And women self-select into these fields, whereas men self-select into STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Now, it just so happens that in modern techno-capitalism, software engineering, advanced mathematics, advanced physics, advanced engineering is higher social status and has far higher wealth compensation. Like, you literally will make more money from STEM professions than you do from the health professions. But women are actively choosing this. And this divide gets stronger the more egalitarian the country. So the most egalitarian countries have the highest rates, the most disproportionate rates of women entering the health professions, as the acronym goes, and the lowest rates of women entering the STEM professions. This is just despite strong government programs to subsidize female engagement in these things. And as a kind of proof of this, if you just Google scholarships for women, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of scholarships directly for only women entering only STEM fields. So despite society's best efforts to get women to select into this, they just don't want to. It is literally women's preference that they not do this. So you end up in this weird situation where feminists are fighting tooth and nail for the rights of women to do things, and in fact to create social norms that women should do things that they actively do not want to do by their own stated preference and by what we see in the actual employment data in places that are much more egalitarian. Finally, I want to make two final points, Gabriel, and you respond to any of these or share anything else you like about the kind of critiques of feminism. The first is this is a bit of an esoteric point, so give me a second. I would argue, in kind of to put it into a sentence, that female control, female leadership in very specific kinds of institutions fundamentally alters the purpose of those institutions and harms them in pretty significant ways. And my favorite example of this is in academia, actually. So we see a very strong gender divide in academia, both amongst students and faculty, where female faculty and female students at a rate of about 70 to 30 say they are in favor of censoring academic ideas that could be harmful to underprivileged groups, minority groups, etc. What this manifests as in concrete terms is academic journals, which ostensibly we would think the purpose of academia is to discover the truth of reality, right? To help us better understand the world, irrespective of if some people don't like those ideas or don't like the way the facts are going or are offended by it. Women that control these academic journals especially will directly stop the publication of controversial but potentially true ideas. And this has a chilling effect on the entirety of academic research, okay? For every one paper you see published by a researcher that gets canceled, that gets retracted by the publishing journal, that gets castigated by the university, potentially even fired. And again, we're seeing a far higher rate of professors being fired now. There's a bunch of data on this as well. For every one of those public events you see, right, where a professor effectively gets canceled for having the wrong ideas, there are another couple dozen who could or were considering pursuing research into a similar line of inquiry who now are no longer going to do so. And this affects some of the things that are most fundamental to improving the human condition, like IQ research, for example, or like a lot of genetic research, because a lot of progressives are strong adherents to the blank slate. I'm not going to go into detail on this because we're going to do a whole episode on IQ in the next 2 weeks. So be on the lookout for that. And genetics and the blank slate and how those things are all kind of tied together. My point is just some of the things that are at the absolute bottom of the foundation of the human condition, right? Like how your genes affect what you can and can't do, how IQ and the general factor of intelligence, G, affects the well-being of people in ways that we can understand what causes G to increase and how we can therefore increase the well-being and prosperity of actual people, is harmed when females and people who have this same kind of ideology take over these institutions and develop leadership roles in these institutions. So again, to be super clear, I'm not arguing women shouldn't be leaders. I am arguing very directly that very specific institutions are harmed by female leadership. Academic institutions are the most clear example of this. There are some other examples of this. There are certain kinds of companies that will not engage in perhaps what could be externally perceived as more risky research because of the kind of feminist and female proclivities for safety and for precaution rather than risk taking. This is especially true in the military domain. So that's another area where we haven't seen female leadership perform as well. So female control of certain kinds of institutions can fundamentally alter and harm the actual purpose of those institutions. And then finally, the kind of last point I want to make here is that feminism has led to a world that has made women have a much harder time finding love, finding partnership, finding the things that they want out of life and out of their love life, especially. As feminism has encouraged, and both formally and informally, women to get educated at higher rates than men. Again, now we have almost 3 women getting a bachelor's degree for every 1 man. We find on average more women have more bachelor's degrees than men. As a result of that, and the wage premium that's associated with that, women make more money than men. Women still are holding on to this deep kind of evolutionary norm to seek out a provider. So women still have an internal norm, and this is very clear in survey data, that they would only consider a long-term partnership or marriage with a man that makes more money than them. So they've caught themselves a bit between a rock and a hard place thanks to feminism. Feminism has simultaneously told them, you must girl boss, right? You must go get a high-paying, high-status job, and, never settle. And also, you must date or marry or form a long-term partnership with a man that is at least your equal, if not your better. And women have expressed a direct preference for this. So they're in a really rough spot where you have a bunch of women competing for a very small pool of men, which creates a social and relational dynamic referred to as hypergamy, where effectively a small group of kind of elite men at the top, and I'm using elite in a very broad sense here. I'm not talking about, I could go into a whole other rant about this, but like the red pill people are just wrong. It's not just like the jacked dude with a 6-pack. There's a lot more to it than that. But we do see, and this is empirically in the data, especially in like Tinder and some other dating applications, but also we see this in just the American General Social Survey. Women are having a lot harder time finding partnerships, long-term stable partnerships than men. One of my favorite examples of this in the data is that when you look at the survey data of young men and young women between the ages of 19 and 30 who say they've been in a relationship over the last year, women say they've been in a relationship at about 5 times the rate of men. So just marinate on that for a second. How's that possible? It's because a lot of these women are dating the same men, which is not good for anyone involved, including the men, actually. So to summarize kind of all of these arguments in a nutshell, I know I went on for a while there, but I have a lot of thoughts on this. The anti-capitalist critique of feminism is just like empirically wrong on its face. B, feminism has been much worse for women and has made women demonstrably, measurably worse off psychologically than they otherwise would be. C, female control of certain types of institutions causes those institutions to be fundamentally harmed and no longer serve the purpose for which they were built. And lastly, the feminist movement has kind of resulted in a dating market and a romantic partnership market dynamic that is very harmful to women's prospects for women being able to attain the goals that they say they seek, which is a high status provider type man. So for all those reasons, the thrust of my argument here is that while the early like first and second waves of feminism made some great points and I think made fantastic social strides that are just objectively good, that modern feminism on the merits and just empirically has done more harm than good to both women and men, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think I fundamentally agree with everything you've said. And a critique I want to add on is something I said pretty early on in the podcast, as I mentioned the tendency to over politicize things that are probably actually just personal psychological or personal social issues. And I'll give some concrete examples for listener. Let's say you're a woman in your workplace and you feel like you're being underpaid. Maybe there is a patriarchal social structure that is prioritizing advancing men in your workplace and they're overpaying them. Maybe. But maybe you need to just learn to be more self-assertive and ask for a raise. Maybe the shitty boyfriend you had who was kind of mean and sexist is a result of male dominance in society and never learning how to view women as human. Maybe. Or maybe he had a bad mother and has some personal issues he needs to work through, and maybe it could have been resolved with a good book and a good therapy session as opposed to radical social change. That's kind of the main thing I want to get at, is that while there are important, specific political issues that feminists have resolved, I do think there are some issues with over-politicizing things that are probably more personal psychological faults, both in men and women, to be very clear. than it is in broad political sort of institutional issues. That's the one thing I want to get to. It's just kind of this call to action that something we've said over and over again in every podcast is like, focus on being the best version of yourself. Read good books, seek philosophy, seek out therapy, or perhaps, confession or whatever is sort of relevant to your community and your values, and find ways to just grow. Because I think you will find that the tendency to over politicize issues often is a confession of internal turmoil. Clean your room, as Jordan Peterson says, because the external world is often an expression of our internal world. And so you'll find that if you start cleaning your inner world and start cleaning your kind of bedroom, the external world will actually start to look more just and more beautiful, even if the laws don't change. There's a good chance that you're over politicizing things that are at their core probably more personal, psychological, personal, social issues.
Completely agreed. Now, I want to make two kind of final points here, Gabriel. And I'm bringing these two up primarily because these come up often in kind of public discourse. And this is one of those examples of something where like the research has, and every researcher in this field says the same thing over and over again. And for some reason, it just never makes its way into the public consciousness. The first thing is you'll still hear all the time about the gender wage gap. And thank goodness Claudia Golden won the Nobel Prize this year. Her research focuses on this almost exclusively. And not exclusively rather, but heavily. And her findings are really unambiguous, which is that male and female earnings are similar. In fact, women starting their career earn slightly more than men on average until women have kids. And then there's something that the economists refer to as the motherhood penalty, because women take a lot of time off work when they have a child, understandably so. They have a lot of kind of responsibility there. There's some things that like breastfeeding that quite literally the father cannot do. So oftentimes the father will return to work much faster from paternity leave or not take paternity leave at all, while women will take ample time off work or even leave work for years at a time, which means they're not developing what economists refer to as human capital, literally the kind of on-the-job tacit knowledge and skills to get better and better so that you can continue advancing in your career and earning more and more money. So basically 100% of the quote unquote gender wage gap that is very just at the kind of meta level, if you just look at all men and all women, is a result of A, the motherhood penalty, B, on average, men work more hours than men, C, men work more hours than women, excuse me, C, or third, the women often prioritize kind of flexible work hours over kind of working harder and more. And that's not to say that women are not working hard enough. This is just, again, objective kind of positive facts I'm stating here. I'm not making any normative claims about like what's right or wrong here. I'm explaining the gender wage gap. And finally, men often enter more lucrative but more risky careers, things like working in startups, working in the software industry, which is often associated with startups, which are very high risk, and then other professions that have actual bodily risk, right, associated with them, which women often shy away from. So when you combine those four factors, you end up, the gender wage gap literally completely disappears. And in many settings, if you have, especially as people get older, men and women that don't have kids and just continue working their whole careers, often on average end up making more than men because the average woman has a higher IQ than the average man, something we've talked about often here. So you end up with a world where once you control for just a few factors that just explain women have different preferences than men, it makes perfect sense that there isn't a quote unquote kind of gender wage gap. So I just wanted to point that one out. And I also wanted to point out one more thing, which is that a lot of, we've run into a bit of a wall in kind of women's progress, and feminists will often bemoan this, that like, oh, the rate of females taking CEO roles or board of director roles or becoming elected public officials has kind of stagnated in a number of respects, just from a pure numerical perspective. But that's because the psychological traits that excel in those fields are often associated with kind of male evolutionary biology. Things like much lower agreeableness, much higher conscientiousness, less neuroticism. So this is one of all factors of the big five factor personality traits that are quite well empirically founded. So in effect, there's the kind of inborn psychology. Men end up just doing better at those roles. Now, that's not to say some women can't do it. There's a reason there's a lot of female CEOs. I'll say very directly, one of Learn Arena's biggest investors and a personal mentor of mine who I have learned a great deal from and who I go to anytime I can't figure something out because she always has a great solution, is a wonderful woman who's an investor, and she supports a lot of startups here in the southeastern United States. So very directly not saying women can't do this. I have at least one woman in my life who is way smarter than me and is way better at this than me, and I go to whenever I have a problem. My point is just on average, right? There's a reason that these tendencies, these kind of statistical averages occur, and it's not because of some amorphous social or cultural discrimination. It's just because of individual preferences, which leads me to reiterate something Gabriel said, which is, especially if you're a woman listening to this, you can actively cultivate some of these personality traits, especially the assertiveness thing. I've helped some women in my life with this as well. Like, if you think you're being underpaid, ask for a raise. Sure, it might be uncomfortable and you might be conflict avoidant, but that's the only way you're going to get it, is if you ask for it. There's not just going to kind of drop in your lap. Or if you want to do things that accumulate more wealth, then be a little bit more in favor of risk. Be a little bit more risk tolerant. Risk is often associated with higher reward, right? And these things, there's one really interesting finding in the research, which is that these big 5 personality traits, while some of it is genetic, it's only like 40% of it or so, which means the other 60%, the majority, is malleable. Like, you can cultivate these traits yourself. So the first thing I would note is just if you still feel like as a woman some of these things are problems for you, you can cultivate these traits yourself. And likewise, as Gabriel said, the solution to kind of the feminist narrative in many respects, and some of the problems feminists point out, is individual action, right? It's not broad scale social revolution or social change. It is individual action on the level of the individual to go after the things you want in life. If you as a woman want to girl boss, want to go be a CEO, a startup founder, an entrepreneur, a lawyer, a doctor, go do it. There's nothing stopping you from doing it. And in fact, for each of those things, there's a lot of formal programs that will help you. As a small example, right, I applied to a few VC firms who ended up telling me after I talked to them, like, hey, we only invest in women, actually, which is fine. Like, go for it. That's totally their right. But my point in saying that is, like, there's a lot of opportunity out there for you, just kind of laying on the ground, ready for you to pick up and run with. Now, I will conclude with a very kind of hard question to answer, and I'll take a stab at it too after you do, Gabriel. Which is, and again, this is purely mine and Gabriel's personal perspective, neither the formal opinion of Learn Arena, nor like what you should think per se as an individual. I want you to make up your own mind, you to go read the philosophers and decide for yourself. But Gabriel, what do you think is the kind of future of the feminist movement here in the developed world? It feels to me like, and I'll just go ahead to give my kind of take on this, and I want to hear yours as well. It feels like they've kind of achieved most of their goals and are a bit stuck insofar as, like, they were like, all right, where do we go from here? So the trans boundary became the latest thing, and fighting for the rights of the LGBTQ plus groups and trans groups as the latest kind of, or perhaps even last group that perhaps was being culturally and socially discriminated against. And they've achieved most of their stated goals, right? Like I mentioned earlier, like, there's nothing stopping and many things encouraging women from entering every high status profession and role under the sun. So it feels to me like, and kind of my personal take on feminism is like, all right, you did it. Like, good job. You achieved everything you sought to achieve. Now focus on yourself and focus on improving the things that you want to improve, because the continued feminist rhetoric, I think, is doing almost nothing but direct harm.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Certainly, there are still areas in the world that desperately need political and social change in favor of women. Areas in the Middle East where women aren't even allowed to vote, aren't allowed to drive, aren't allowed to walk around in public, showing off their hair. So certainly a very good direction for feminism to head is continuing the international kind of perspective and looking at ways we can support women who are actively living in the harmful patriarchies that we're making note of. I have noticed on a personal level, many of the women in my life either are themselves sort of non-feminists. They're like, oh, I don't need feminism. Or they go that direction, or they're the women I've noticed who are very hyper-feminist. There tends to be some issues. They tend to over-politicize kind of personal psychological stuff like I was mentioning. And so probably a healthy perspective is just acknowledging that feminism, if we simply believe feminism to be just like advocating for equal rights, is true and useful. But as you mentioned, learning to focus more on that personal thing. Like, if feminism is about giving women the choice to live and and choose the type of life they want, well, you need to choose. There's a punk lyric that goes, if freedom means doing what I want, then I gotta want something. And I think that's really the big thing. It's like, okay, cool, you made the progress, what are you gonna do with it? How are you going to be happy? And sure, there are still areas where you can fight. If you believe that abortion rights are a fundamental aspect of your feminism, then that is a political area to continue fighting. But don't get lost in the politics. Focus on that individual personal growth. So the personal growth and the international aspects, I think, is what stands out to me.
Yeah, I think the international aspect I neglected accidentally, but I think is a great point. There's still some very basic battles, again, for basic human dignity for women across the world that need to take place, where they've succeeded. The feminist movement has succeeded in the Western world, but has absolutely not done so yet in the developing world, in a number of, especially Muslim countries. So I think that, especially if feminists are looking for an outlet for that kind of social agitation and looking for the next frontier of social progress, that seems very clear to me that is the answer. That, and as you said, personal growth and personal development to achieve what you want now that you have the freedom to do so. Oft neglected in discussions of freedom is that, as Sartre pointed out, freedom could be a bit of a prison, because now the question is, now what, right? All right, you have your freedom, your radical ability to do anything and everything in life. What are you going to do with it? And that, I think, is the fundamental question you have to answer to lead a fulfilling and meaningful life. So with that, we will call it a day. Thank you all so much for joining us. Please, if you enjoyed this, like, comment, subscribe, especially if you kind of have thoughts on this topic, either comment on this video or join our Discord, which you can find links to all over our social media, as well as in our Substack, which you can also sign up for, learnerarena.substack.com. So there's a number of ways you can kind of get in touch with us. If you want to discuss these things, and especially if you want to learn kind of more about any of these topics, and especially about how to think rationally, how to think critically, highly encourage you to go to learnerarena.com and take some of our courses. We're building our course library out by the day, and I think you'll find a lot to learn there. So with that, thank you all so much and have a wonderful day.